She was thrown out on the street like garbage. When the billionaire witnessed her humiliation, what he did next changed everything. Her scattered belongings painted a portrait of desperation across the sun-bleached concrete, and as the luxury sedan's engine purred to a stop, billionaire Harrison Sterling witnessed something that would shatter his carefully constructed world forever. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story. The morning sun cast long shadows across Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills, California, as Harrison Sterling adjusted his Italian silk tie in the backseat of his black Bentley Mulsanne. At 42, he had built an empire that stretched from tech startups in Silicon Valley to real estate developments across 3 continents. His steel-gray eyes, which had stared down corporate sharks and intimidated board members into submission, now focused on the morning's agenda displayed on his platinum-plated tablet. "Mr. Sterling, we'll arrive at the Meridian Hotel in approximately 4 minutes," his driver, James, announced through the partition. Harrison barely acknowledged the statement. His mind was already 3 moves ahead, calculating the potential returns from the luxury hotel acquisition that would cement his position as the West Coast's most formidable real estate mogul. The Meridian wasn't just a property, it was a statement. A declaration that Harrison Sterling owned everything worth owning in this city. The Bentley glided through the pristine streets where palm trees stood like sentinels, their fronds barely stirring in the artificially perfected California air. This was Harrison's world, a realm of polished chrome, climate-controlled comfort, and transactions measured in millions. He had worked 16-hour days for 2 decades to escape the suffocating poverty of his childhood in Detroit, building walls around himself as impenetrable as the gated communities where he now resided. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. "Meridian meeting confirmed. Property assessment complete. Recommend immediate acquisition." Harrison's lips curved into a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He had learned long ago that sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. Every decision was calculated, every relationship transactional, every emotion carefully controlled. It was this ruthless efficiency that had transformed him from a broke kid with calloused hands into a man whose net worth exceeded the GDP of small countries. But 20 miles away, in a cramped apartment building in East Los Angeles, another story was unfolding, one that would soon collide with Harrison's meticulously ordered existence in ways he never could have imagined. Naomi Washington pressed her face against the thin apartment window, watching the morning shadows shift across the cracked pavement below. At 28, she possessed an understated beauty that poverty had tried but failed to diminish. High cheekbones that spoke of inherited strength, dark eyes that held depths of compassion despite the hardship she'd endured, and natural hair that she wore in protective styles she'd learned from YouTube tutorials when she couldn't afford salon visits. Her fingers traced the final notice taped to the glass, the red letters seeming to pulse with menace. Eviction, 24 hours to vacate. 3 months of unemployment had led to this moment. 3 months of choosing between groceries and rent, between her daughter's school supplies and utilities, between dignity and desperation. "Mama, are we really going to be okay?" The small voice belonged to Zoe, her 7-year-old daughter, who sat cross-legged on their threadbare couch, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit. Naomi turned from the window, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the storm raging in her chest. "Of course, baby girl. Mama's got everything under control." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but she had become an expert at swallowing her own fear to protect her daughter's innocence. 6 months ago, she had been a teaching assistant at Roosevelt Elementary, helping children with reading difficulties while pursuing her education degree through night classes. She had dreams then, modest but beautiful dreams of becoming a full-time teacher, of providing Zoe with stability, of proving that their circumstances didn't define their potential. Then the budget cuts came. Pink slips distributed like confetti at a funeral, eliminating positions deemed non-essential. Naomi had watched her supervisor's apologetic smile as her world crumbled, knowing that her dedication meant nothing when spreadsheets demanded sacrifice. A sharp knock on the door interrupted her memories. Naomi's heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the pattern. 3 quick raps, a pause, then 2 more. The landlord's enforcer. "Mrs. Washington, I know you're in there," called a gravelly voice through the thin wood. "Time's up. You've got 30 minutes to get your stuff out before we change the locks." Naomi closed her eyes, drawing on reserves of strength she wasn't sure she possessed. She had exactly $47 in her checking account, a tank of gas that was nearly empty, and nowhere to go. Her pride had kept her from calling her sister in Phoenix, the same pride that had driven her to leave home at 18 rather than accept charity she couldn't repay. "Zoe, honey, we need to pack quickly," she said, her voice betraying none of the desperation clawing at her insides. As they gathered their belongings, clothes stuffed into garbage bags, treasured books wrapped in towels, Zoe's art projects carefully stacked in a showbox, Naomi fought the rising panic that threatened to consume her. She had always been the strong one, the problem solver, the woman who found a way when there seemed to be no way. But now, as she looked at their entire life reduced to a handful of bags and boxes, she felt something she had never allowed herself to feel before: defeat. What would you do if you had to choose between your pride and your child's security? Share your thoughts below. Sometimes the hardest decisions reveal our true character. The 30 minutes passed like seconds. Soon, Naomi found herself standing on the sidewalk outside the apartment building, surrounded by their possessions, with Zoe's small hand gripping hers tightly. The morning sun, which had seemed so promising from inside their apartment, now felt harsh and unforgiving. Other tenants walked past, some offering sympathetic glances, others purposefully avoiding eye contact. Naomi understood both reactions. She had once been the one averting her gaze from others' misfortunes, telling herself it could never happen to her. "Mama, where are we going to sleep tonight?" Zoe asked, her voice small and confused. Naomi knelt down, cupping her daughter's face in her hands. "We're going to figure it out, baby. Sometimes life gives us adventures we didn't plan for." But even as she spoke the words, Naomi felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her shoulders. She had no family in Los Angeles, no close friends with extra rooms, no safety net beyond her own determination. For the first time in her adult life, she was truly alone with her child, facing a future that stretched before them like an endless, unmarked road. As she stood there on the sidewalk, surrounded by the remnants of her carefully constructed life, Naomi Washington had no way of knowing that 20 miles away, a black Bentley was making its way through the manicured streets of Beverly Hills, carrying a man whose own carefully constructed world was about to collide with hers in ways that would change both of their lives forever. The morning sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows on the concrete, as if the universe itself was holding its breath for what was to come. How do you think Harrison and Naomi's worlds will collide? What would it take for a billionaire to truly see beyond his own privileged bubble? Harrison's Bentley turned onto Wilshire Boulevard, the familiar route to the Meridian Hotel acquisition meeting that would add another jewel to his real estate crown. He was reviewing the final contract terms when James's voice cut through his concentration. "Sir, there seems to be some kind of commotion ahead. Traffic's backing up." Harrison glanced up from his tablet, irritation flickering across his features. Time was money, and delays were unacceptable. "Take the side street. We can't be late." "Yes, sir." James smoothly maneuvered the Bentley onto a quieter residential street that would bypass the congestion. This wasn't Harrison's usual route, a tree-lined avenue where older apartment buildings stood shoulder to shoulder with small businesses, their facades weathered by decades of Los Angeles sun. As they drove through this unfamiliar territory, Harrison barely registered the change in scenery. His mind remained focused on profit margins and acquisition strategies, the world outside his tinted windows as distant as a television show he wasn't watching. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. 3 blocks away, Naomi Washington stood on the sidewalk clutching a crumpled piece of paper, the phone number for a homeless shelter that supposedly had a waiting list. She had spent the last hour making calls from her dying cell phone, each conversation ending with the same soul-crushing words: "I'm sorry, we don't have any availability." Zoe sat on their larger suitcase, her legs swinging restlessly as she hummed a song she'd learned in school. Her innocence was both Naomi's greatest motivation and her deepest source of pain. How could she explain to a 7-year-old that their entire world had crumbled overnight? Mrs. Washington. The voice belonged to Marcus Chen, the property manager who had been pressuring her for months. He approached with 2 maintenance workers in tow, their expressions ranging from apologetic to coldly professional. "Please," Naomi said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just need a few more days. I have a job interview tomorrow. I'm sorry, but the decision's been made." Marcus's tone carried the finality of a judge's gavel. "The building's been sold to Sterling Development Group. They want all delinquent tenants out immediately to begin renovations." The name hit Naomi like a physical blow. Sterling Development Group, she'd seen their signs throughout the city, marking properties where longtime residents had been displaced to make room for luxury condominiums that sold for millions. Now they were the invisible force behind her family's destruction. "You can't just throw us out like this," she said, desperation creeping into her voice. "I have a child. Where are we supposed to go?" Marcus avoided her eyes. "That's not my problem anymore. You had 3 months to figure this out." One of the maintenance workers, a young man who looked uncomfortable with the situation, stepped forward. "Look, lady, we don't want to make this harder than it has to be. But if you don't move your stuff, we're authorized to dispose of it." The words hung in the air like a threat. Naomi felt her world tilting, the careful composure she'd maintained for Zoe's sake beginning to crack. She looked at their possessions scattered on the sidewalk, their entire life reduced to bags and boxes that could be labeled as disposal with the stroke of a pen. "Mama." Zoe's voice was small, confused. "What does dispose mean?" Naomi knelt beside her daughter, fighting back tears that threatened to spill over. "It means we need to find a new adventure, baby girl." But even as she spoke the words, Naomi felt something breaking inside her chest. The strength that had carried her through every hardship, every setback, every moment when the world seemed determined to defeat her, it was cracking like ice under the weight of impossible circumstances. Harrison's Bentley rounded the corner onto the street where Naomi stood with her daughter, though he remained oblivious to the drama unfolding outside his climate-controlled sanctuary. He was dictating notes to his voice recorder when James suddenly slowed the vehicle. "Sir, there's a situation ahead. Looks like an eviction in progress." Harrison glanced up with mild annoyance. These scenes were unfortunately common in the city's transitioning neighborhoods, collateral damage from the urban development that had made him wealthy. He typically didn't spare them a second thought. "Just drive around it," he said dismissively, returning to his notes. But as the Bentley approached the small crowd gathered on the sidewalk, something made Harrison look more closely. Perhaps it was the way the morning light fell across the scene, or the stark contrast between the woman's dignified posture and her desperate circumstances, or the small child sitting so trustingly amid the chaos of displaced belongings. Through the tinted glass, he watched as one of the maintenance workers gestured impatiently at the scattered possessions. The woman, he could see her more clearly now, stood with her back straight despite the obvious weight of defeat on her shoulders. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with the surface glamour Harrison was accustomed to, a beauty rooted in strength and dignity that poverty couldn't diminish. "Pull over," Harrison found himself saying, the words surprising him as much as they surprised James. "Sir." "I said pull over. Park across the street." James complied without question, though Harrison caught his confused glance in the rearview mirror. Harrison couldn't explain his sudden interest in this particular scene of urban hardship. He had passed thousands of similar situations without a second thought, insulated by wealth and willful blindness to the suffering his business empire sometimes created. But something about this woman and her child had penetrated his armor of indifference. The confrontation on the sidewalk was escalating. Naomi watched in growing horror as the maintenance workers began loading her belongings onto a truck, not to transport them somewhere safe, but to dispose of them as promised. Her daughter's artwork, the books she'd saved from her college years, The family photos that were all they had left of Zoe's father, everything was being treated like refuse. "Stop," she called out, her voice cracking with desperation. "Please, those are our things." "Lady, you were warned," one of the workers replied, not unkindly but with the detachment of someone following orders. "This stuff's got to go." Naomi ran toward the truck, reaching for a box that contained Zoe's baby clothes, items she'd kept not out of sentimentality but because she couldn't afford to replace them if needed. The worker blocking her path was twice her size, his expression apologetic but unmovable. Please step back. Those are my daughter's things." Naomi's composure finally shattered, her voice rising to a level that carried across the street. "You can't just throw away a child's belongings like they're garbage." The word garbage echoed in the morning air, and Harrison Sterling, watching from his Bentley, felt something shift inside his chest. He had spent his career reducing human lives to numbers on spreadsheets, viewing displaced families as necessary casualties in the war of urban development. But seeing this woman's anguish, hearing her desperate plea, he suddenly understood the human cost of his success in a way that mere statistics had never conveyed. Sometimes we don't realize the true impact of our choices until we see them through someone else's eyes. What moments have opened your eyes to uncomfortable truths? Share your experiences below. Zoe, frightened by her mother's distress, began to cry. The sound cut through the morning air like a blade, reaching Harrison even through the Bentley soundproofing. He watched as Naomi immediately knelt beside her daughter, pulling the child into her arms and whispering reassurances even as their world collapsed around them. "It's okay, baby," Naomi murmured, her voice thick with tears she refused to shed. "Mama's here. Everything's going to be okay." But it wasn't okay. Harrison could see that from his vantage point across the street. This woman was drowning, holding her child above the water even as she went under herself. And somewhere in the pit of his stomach, he felt a familiar sensation, one he hadn't experienced since childhood, when he'd watched his own mother struggle to keep their family afloat after his father abandoned them. The maintenance workers continued their systematic removal of belongings, treating each item with the casual indifference reserved for actual garbage. A framed photograph fell from one of the boxes, the glass shattering on the pavement. Harrison saw the woman flinch as if she'd been physically struck. Marcus Chen, the property manager, approached her with a clipboard. "I need you to sign this acknowledging that you've vacated the premises voluntarily." Voluntarily. Naomi's voice was raw with disbelief. "You're throwing us out on the street and calling it voluntary." You were given proper notice. Your failure to comply with the lease terms." "My failure." Naomi stood up, her daughter clinging to her leg. "I lost my job because of budget cuts. I've been trying to find work for months. I'm not a failure. I'm a mother doing everything I can to survive." The words hit Harrison like physical blows. He had heard similar stories countless times, usually filtered through lawyers and property managers who reduced human suffering to legal terminology. But witnessing it firsthand, seeing the dignity with which this woman faced her humiliation, he felt something awakening inside him that he had thought died years ago. Compassion. It was a dangerous emotion for a man in his position. Compassion was inefficient. It clouded judgment and compromised profit margins. He had built his empire by keeping it carefully locked away, allowing only calculated charity that came with tax benefits and good publicity. But watching this scene unfold, Harrison found his carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. The final indignity came when one of the workers accidentally knocked over Zoe's small suitcase, spilling her clothes across the dirty sidewalk. A tiny pink dress, probably the child's favorite, landed in a puddle, the fabric immediately soaking up the murky water. Zoe broke away from her mother and ran toward the dress, her small hands reaching for it even as the worker stepped around her, focused on his task. "My dress," she cried, holding up the soaked garment. "Mama, they ruined my dress." Naomi looked at her daughter, at the bewildered pain in those innocent eyes, at the way her small shoulders shook with incomprehension at the world's cruelty, and something inside her broke completely. She sank to her knees on the concrete, pulling Zoe close, no longer able to maintain the brave face that had gotten them this far. For a moment, they sat there on the sidewalk surrounded by the debris of their life, two figures painted in shades of defeat and abandonment. The morning sun beat down mercilessly, and the city moved around them with the indifference of a machine that ground up lives without noticing. It was then that Harrison Sterling made a decision that would change everything. He opened the Bentley's door and stepped onto the street, his handmade Italian shoes touching pavement that existed in a world completely foreign to his experience. The sounds hit him immediately: traffic, voices, the mechanical whir of the disposal truck. The smells followed: exhaust, hot asphalt, and underneath it all, the scent of desperation that he had never been close enough to detect. James watched in amazement as his employer, who never set foot outside his luxury vehicles without security and detailed planning, walked across the street toward the eviction scene. Harrison moved with purpose, though he couldn't have articulated what that purpose was if asked. He only knew that he couldn't sit in his fortress of wealth and watch this woman and her child be discarded like refuse. Not anymore. Not when he finally understood that behind every property acquisition, every development project, every line item in his profit and loss statements, there were real people with real faces and real suffering. As he approached the group on the sidewalk, Harrison caught Marcus Chen's attention. The property manager's eyes widened in recognition and disbelief. "Mr. Sterling." "Sir, I didn't expect, we weren't told you'd be." "Stop," Harrison said quietly, his voice carrying the authority that had built an empire. "Stop everything. Now." The workers froze mid-task, unclear about what was happening but recognizing power when they heard it. Naomi looked up from where she knelt with her daughter, her eyes meeting Harrison's for the first time. In that moment, something passed between them, a recognition that transcended their different worlds, an understanding that this moment would define them both. Harrison Sterling, the billionaire who had built his fortune on the calculated displacement of people like Naomi Washington, stood at a crossroads. Behind him lay the safe, profitable world of spreadsheets and strategic indifference. Ahead lay something far more dangerous: the possibility of redemption, and the terrifying prospect of becoming the man he might have been if life hadn't taught him that caring was a luxury he couldn't afford. The morning sun seemed to pause in its arc across the sky, waiting to see which path he would choose. The moment of truth has arrived. What do you think Harrison will do next? Will he retreat to his safe world of wealth and indifference, or will he find the courage to act? Share your predictions below. The silence that followed Harrison's command stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Marcus Chen stood frozen, his clipboard trembling slightly in his hands as he processed the impossible scene before him. Harrison Sterling, the man whose signature appeared on acquisition contracts worth hundreds of millions, standing on a cracked sidewalk intervening in a routine eviction. "Sir," Marcus stammered, "I don't understand. This is standard procedure for the Washington property. The tenant is 3 months behind on rent, and per your company's directive." "I said stop." Harrison's voice carried the weight of boardroom authority, but something else lurked beneath, an unfamiliar tremor that might have been uncertainty. "Put everything back." The maintenance workers exchanged confused glances. One of them, a weathered man with paint-stained coveralls, cleared his throat. "Mr. Sterling, we've already loaded half the truck. It'll take time to." "Then take the time." Harrison's steel-gray eyes swept over the scattered belongings, taking inventory of a life he had inadvertently helped destroy. A child's drawing caught his attention, a crayon portrait of two figures holding hands under smiling sun, the word family written in uneven letters across the top. "Put it all back. Every single item." Naomi remained on her knees, holding Zoe close, her mind struggling to process what was happening. She had heard the name Sterling, had seen the recognition in the property manager's eyes, but the reality seemed too surreal to accept. Harrison Sterling, the faceless corporate entity who had been evicting families throughout East LA, was standing 10 feet away, halting her eviction with the casual authority of someone accustomed to reshaping the world with words. "Mama," Zoe whispered, her voice muffled against Naomi's shoulder. "Who is that man?" Before Naomi could answer, Harrison took a step closer, his expensive shoes crunching on broken glass from the shattered picture frame. Up close, she could see the conflict playing out across his features, the rigid control he was famous for warring with something raw and unguarded. He said, his voice gentler than she had expected. "I apologize for this misunderstanding." Naomi's composure, already fractured by the morning's events, threatened to crumble entirely at his choice of words. Misunderstanding. As if her family's destruction was merely a clerical error that could be corrected with the stroke of a pen. Misunderstanding. She rose slowly to her feet, Zoe still clinging to her leg, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Is that what you call it when you buy buildings full of families and throw them out like trash?" The accusation hit Harrison like a physical blow, its accuracy making it all the more painful. He had spent years insulating himself from the human cost of his business decisions, surrounding himself with lawyers and managers who translated suffering into sanitized legal language. But standing here, facing this woman's righteous anger, he couldn't hide behind corporate euphemisms. "You're right," he said quietly, the admission surprising them both. "That's exactly what I've been doing." Marcus Chen's eyes widened in alarm. In all his years working for Sterling Development, he had never heard his employer acknowledge any fault in their business practices. The admission felt dangerous, like a crack in a dam that could bring everything crashing down. "Sir, perhaps we should discuss this privately." "No." Harrison's gaze remained fixed on Naomi, studying the play of emotions across her face. Anger, confusion, a carefully guarded hope she was fighting not to feel. This conversation should have happened a long time ago. The workers had begun the laborious process of unloading the truck, handling Naomi's belongings with a care that had been absent during the initial removal. But the damage was already done. Clothes streaked with dirt, a lamp with a cracked shade, books with bent covers. Each item bore the scars of its brief journey toward disposal. Naomi watched the process with mixed emotions. Relief battled with suspicion. Gratitude warred with pride. She had learned early in life that when powerful men offered help, there was usually a price attached, one that vulnerable women like her couldn't afford to pay. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos of emotions beneath the surface. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. What did he want? An hour ago, his desires had been simple. Close the Meridian deal, expand his empire, maintain the careful distance between himself and the consequences of his success. Now, standing in the wreckage of this woman's life, he found those goals suddenly hollow. "I want to understand," he said finally. "How we got here." "How I got here." "We got here because you decided our home was worth more empty than full of families," Naomi replied, her tone sharp with years of accumulated frustration. "You got here because you never bothered to see us as anything more than obstacles to your profit margins." Each word was a scalpel, cutting through the layers of justification Harrison had built around his business practices. He thought of the dozens of properties he had acquired, the hundreds of families displaced, the thousands of lives disrupted in service of his vision of urban renewal. He had told himself it was progress, that he was improving neighborhoods and creating jobs. But looking at Zoe's tear-stained face, he could no longer ignore the cost of that progress. "You're right," he said again, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "But I'm here now. Let me make this right." "Make it right." Naomi's laugh was bitter, edged with hysteria. "You think you can just wave your hand and undo months of terror? Nights when I held my daughter while she cried because her friends were being evicted? Days when I chose between her lunch money and keeping the lights on?" Harrison felt each accusation like a physical blow, but he forced himself to listen, to absorb the full weight of his impact on lives he had never bothered to consider. This was his education in humanity, long overdue and more painful than any business failure he had ever endured. "I can't undo the past," he admitted, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. "But I can change what happens next." "Can you?" Naomi's eyes blazed with a fierce intelligence that had been honed by survival. Or will you get back in your fancy car tomorrow and forget this ever happened? Will we just be another feel-good story you tell at charity dinners? The question struck home because Harrison recognized its validity. How many times had he made grand gestures that cost him nothing and changed nothing? How many ribbon cuttings and donation ceremonies had he attended while the machinery of displacement continued grinding away in the background? I don't know, he said, and the honesty in his admission surprised them both. I've never been in this position before. What position is that? Naomi asked, though something in her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Caring about the consequences. Have you ever had a moment where you suddenly saw the real impact of your choices on others? What changed for you after that realization? Share your story below. The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and dangerous. Harrison had built his empire on emotional detachment, on the ability to make decisions based purely on logic and profit potential. Caring was inefficient. Caring was weak. Caring was the luxury of people who couldn't afford to be ruthless. But standing here, watching workers carefully restore belongings to a woman who had every reason to hate him, Harrison felt something stirring that he had thought permanently buried. It was uncomfortable and unfamiliar, like exercising muscles that had atrophied from disuse. Zoe had been quietly observing the adults' conversation, her 7-year-old mind processing what she could understand while filing away the rest for later consideration. Now she stepped forward, her small hand slipping into her mother's, and looked up at Harrison with the direct gaze that only children could manage. "Are you going to help us?" she asked, her voice clear and innocent. The simple question stripped away all the complexity, all the corporate jargon and legal complications and financial considerations. It reduced the situation to its essential truth. Here was a child who needed help, and here was a man with the power to provide it. Harrison knelt down, bringing himself to Zoe's eye level, his expensive suit heedless of the dirty pavement. Up close, he could see that she had her mother's eyes, intelligent, resilient, beautiful despite everything they had endured. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Zoe," she replied, then added with the careful politeness her mother had taught her, "What's yours?" "Harrison," he said, and felt a strange emotion at introducing himself by his first name rather than his title. When was the last time someone had asked for his name without already knowing who he was? "It's nice to meet you, Zoe." "Are you rich?" she asked with the blunt curiosity of childhood. Harrison glanced up at Naomi, who was watching the interaction with a mixture of wariness and wonder. "Yes," he said simply. "I am." "Then why are you dressed so fancy to throw people out of their homes?" The question hit him like a slap, delivered with the innocent brutality that only children could achieve. Out of the mouths of babes came truths that adults spent lifetimes avoiding. Harrison struggled for an answer that wouldn't sound like an excuse. "I didn't think about it that way before." "But you're thinking about it now." Zoe persisted. "Yes," he said, surprised by how much that simple admission cost him. "I'm thinking about it now." Naomi watched this exchange with growing confusion. The man kneeling before her daughter bore little resemblance to the corporate shark she had imagined when she cursed the name Sterling in her darkest moments. This man showed vulnerability, uncertainty, a capacity for shame that suggested the possibility of conscience. But she had learned to be wary of powerful men who made promises. Her own father had been full of grand gestures and empty commitments, disappearing whenever his words required backing up with action. And Zoe's father had been the same, charming and convincing until the moment responsibility demanded sacrifice. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "I appreciate you stopping this eviction. But my daughter and I don't need charity from someone whose business model depends on our displacement." Harrison rose to his feet, recognizing the walls she was erecting and understanding their necessity. He had built similar barriers around his own heart, fortifications designed to keep out anything that might compromise his carefully maintained control. "It's not charity," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure what it was. It's recognition of a debt. What debt? Harrison looked around at the scene, the workers still carefully unloading belongings, Marcus standing nearby with barely concealed anxiety, the neighbors who had gathered to watch this unprecedented drama unfold on their street. How could he explain the debt of indifference, the compound interest of willful blindness, the cost of building wealth on a foundation of others' displacement? The debt I owe to every family I've never seen, he said finally. To every child whose toys ended up in a dumpster because I needed to maximize square footage. To every dream I've crushed without bothering to notice. Naomi studied his face, searching for signs of manipulation or calculated empathy. She had become an expert at detecting insincerity, a skill honed by years of navigating systems designed to exploit vulnerability. But what she saw in Harrison's eyes was something she hadn't expected. Genuine horror at his own capacity for harm. Pretty words, she said cautiously. But words don't pay rent or put food on the table. No, Harrison agreed. They don't. But actions do. What actions? This was the moment of truth, the point where Harrison would either commit to a path he had never traveled or retreat to the safety of his insulated world. He thought about the Meridian Hotel meeting he was missing, the deals that would suffer from his absence, the empire that demanded his constant attention. But he also thought about Zoe's question, why was he dressed so fancy to throw people out of their homes? And realized that he couldn't go back to being the man who had awakened that morning. That man was dead, killed by a 7-year-old's innocent curiosity and her mother's righteous anger. Your apartment, he said, his voice gaining strength as he committed to words he couldn't take back. It's yours. Permanently. No rent, no conditions, no time limits. Marcus Chen's clipboard clattered to the ground. Sir, you can't. The property is scheduled for demolition next month. The luxury condos will be built somewhere else, Harrison said, his tone brooking no argument. Find another location. But the contracts, the investors, are my responsibility, not yours. Harrison's voice carried the authority that had built his empire, but now it was directed toward protection rather than profit. Ms. Washington, would you be willing to accept that arrangement? Naomi felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, reality rearranging itself in ways she couldn't fully process. Part of her wanted to accept immediately, to grab this lifeline and hold on tight. But another part, the part that had learned survival through self-reliance, recoiled from accepting help that seemed too good to be true. Why? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why would you do that? Harrison was quiet for a long moment, considering the question that would define the rest of his life. Why indeed? Because he was tired of being a man whose wealth was built on others' suffering? Because a child's innocent question had shattered his carefully constructed rationalizations? Because he had finally seen himself clearly and found the reflection unbearable? Because, he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would change everything, I want to be the kind of man who helps rather than harms. And I think this is where I start learning how. The words hung in the morning air, a promise and a prayer wrapped in the uncertainty of a man discovering his own capacity for goodness. Around them, the city continued its indifferent march toward profit, but on this one street corner, something had shifted in the balance between power and compassion. Whether that shift would hold, whether Harrison Sterling could truly transform from destroyer to protector, remained to be seen. But as Naomi looked into his eyes and saw something she had never expected to find there, hope, she felt her own carefully guarded walls beginning to crack. The real test, she knew, would come not in this moment of crisis but in the days and weeks ahead, when the cameras were gone and the stakes were higher than one family's survival. Would Harrison Sterling prove to be the man he claimed he wanted to become, or would he retreat to the safety of his tower, leaving them more vulnerable than before? Only time would tell. But for now, surrounded by the restored remnants of their life, Naomi allowed herself to feel something she hadn't experienced in months, the possibility that tomorrow might be better than today. Trust is earned through actions, not words. What would it take for you to believe in someone's promise to change? Share your thoughts on second chances below. 3 days had passed since the sidewalk confrontation that stopped Naomi's eviction, but the ripple effects of Harrison's decision were only beginning to unfold. The luxury condo project he had cancelled represented a $40 million investment, and his partners were not taking the loss quietly. Harrison sat in his corner office on the 42nd floor of the Sterling Tower, watching the sunset over Los Angeles while his legal team delivered increasingly dire updates. The Meridian Hotel acquisition had fallen through when he missed the crucial meeting. His investors were threatening lawsuits, and his board of directors had called an emergency session for the following morning. "Sir," his assistant Victoria knocked softly on the door, "the board members are here for the preliminary discussion you requested." Harrison nodded, straightening his tie with fingers that weren't quite steady. He had built his empire through calculated risks and ruthless efficiency, but what he was about to propose defied every principle that had made him successful. He was about to ask men who measured success solely in profit margins to support a decision based purely on human decency. The 7 board members filed into his office, their expressions ranging from concerned to openly hostile. Richard Blackwood, the lead investor, took his usual position directly across from Harrison's desk, his silver hair gleaming under the office lights like polished steel. "Harrison," he began without preamble, "we need to discuss your episode 3 days ago. The Washington property situation has cost us millions, and frankly, your behavior is concerning the entire board." "My behavior," Harrison repeated, his voice carefully controlled. "You mean showing basic human decency?" "I mean abandoning a profitable development project to play savior to a single tenant," Blackwood snapped. "Since when do we allow emotional decisions to override sound business practices?" Harrison stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city he had helped reshape through decades of calculated development. From this height, the people below looked like ants, insignificant and anonymous. It was a perspective that had once comforted him, this god's-eye view that reduced human complexity to manageable abstractions. "Tell me, Richard," he said without turning around, "when did we stop seeing the people our decisions affect as human beings?" "The moment we accepted fiduciary responsibility to our shareholders," Blackwood replied coldly. "We're not a charity, Harrison. We're a business. And businesses that prioritize feelings over profits don't survive. Is that what we tell ourselves?" Harrison turned to face the men who had helped him build his empire, studying their faces as if seeing them for the first time. That maximizing profit justifies any level of human suffering. Board member Thomas Chen, Marcus's uncle and the man who had originally recommended the aggressive tenant displacement strategy, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Harrison, you're talking like the bleeding hearts who protest our developments. We provide housing. We create jobs. We improve neighborhoods. We destroy communities," Harrison countered, his voice gaining strength. "We displace families who have lived in the same neighborhood for generations. We turn homes into investment vehicles and wonder why the city feels increasingly soulless. This is about that woman and her child, isn't it?" Blackwood's tone carried a note of patronizing understanding. "Look, I get it. Sometimes we see individual cases that tug at the heartstrings. But we can't run a billion-dollar company based on emotional responses to isolated incidents." Isolated incidents. Harrison's control finally cracked, months of suppressed guilt erupting in his voice. "We've displaced over 3,000 families in the past 5 years. 3,000. How many children have watched their belongings thrown into dumpsters so we could maximize square footage? How many dreams have we crushed for the sake of profit margins?" The silence that followed was deafening. These men had worked with Harrison for years, had seen him navigate hostile takeovers and market crashes with ice-cold calculation. This emotional outburst was unprecedented and deeply unsettling. "What exactly are you proposing?" asked Jonathan Myers, the youngest board member and Harrison's former protege. Harrison returned to his desk, pulling out a thick folder he had spent the last 3 days preparing. I'm proposing we fundamentally change how Sterling development operates. Instead of displacing existing communities, we partner with them. Instead of building luxury housing that locals can't afford, we create mixed-income developments that serve everyone. The profit margins, Blackwood began, will be smaller, Harrison acknowledged, but sustainable and ethical. Ethical. Blackwood's laugh was sharp and humorless. Since when do market forces care about ethics? You want to handicap our company with feel-good policies while our competitors maximize their advantages. I want to build something worth leaving behind, Harrison said quietly. Something more than just another fortune built on others' misery. The room erupted in arguments, voices overlapping as years of business philosophy clashed with Harrison's newfound conscience. Through it all, he found himself thinking not of profit projections or market analyses, but of Zoe's innocent question: why was he dressed so fancy to throw people out of their homes? The answer, he realized, was that he had been playing a role for so long that he had forgotten it was a costume. The ruthless businessman, the corporate shark, the man who could make hard decisions without flinching, it had all been armor designed to protect him from feeling the weight of his choices. But armor, once cracked, was impossible to repair. 20 miles away, Naomi sat in her restored apartment, surrounded by belongings that bore the scars of their brief journey toward disposal. She had spent the last 3 days waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Harrison Sterling to reveal the true cost of his seemingly generous offer. But no demands had come. No contracts to sign, no conditions to meet, no expectations of gratitude or subservience. The apartment was simply hers, as promised, and the silence from Sterling Development was both comforting and deeply unsettling. Zoe was coloring at the kitchen table, her concentration absolute as she worked on a new drawing. This one showed 3 figures holding hands, herself, her mother, and a tall man in a dark suit with kind eyes. "Who's that?" Naomi asked, pointing to the suited figure. "Harrison," Zoe replied without looking up. "He's our friend now." The simple declaration made Naomi's chest tighten with anxiety. In her daughter's world, people were either friends or strangers, good or bad, helpful or harmful. The complex calculations of adult relationships, the weighing of motives, the assessment of risk, the careful management of vulnerability, were foreign concepts to a 7-year-old's trusting heart. But Naomi had learned that when powerful men offered help, there was always a price. The question was when that price would be revealed and whether she would be able to pay it. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Ms. Washington, this is Victoria, Mr. Sterling's assistant. He would very much like to speak with you this evening if possible. Would 7 p.m. work for you?" Naomi stared at the message, her stomach knotting with familiar anxiety. Here it was, the moment when the fairy tale ended and reality reasserted itself. Harrison had had time to think, to calculate, to realize that his impulsive gesture needed to be modified into something more businesslike and manageable. She texted back, "7 p.m. is fine. Should I come to your office?" The response came quickly, "He would prefer to meet somewhere comfortable for you. Perhaps the coffee shop on your corner." The suggestion surprised her. In her experience, powerful men insisted on meeting on their own territory, surrounded by the symbols of their authority. But Harrison was offering to come to her neighborhood, to meet on neutral ground. Maybe that meant something. Or maybe it was just another manipulation technique, designed to put her at ease before delivering whatever blow was coming. Either way, she would face it. She had survived her father's abandonment, her ex-boyfriend's betrayal, months of unemployment, and the terror of homelessness. Whatever Harrison Sterling had to say, she could handle it. "Zoe, baby," she called. "Mrs. Rodriguez from next door is going to watch you for a little while tonight. Mama has a meeting." "With Harrison?" Zoe asked hopefully. "Yes, sweetheart. With Harrison. Tell him I finished his picture." Zoe held up her drawing proudly. "Maybe he wants to be in our family." The words hit Naomi like a physical blow. She knelt beside her daughter, taking the small hands in hers, trying to find words that would protect without crushing hope. "Baby, you know Harrison is a very busy man with a very different life from ours, right? Sometimes adults help each other without becoming family." Zoe's face fell slightly, but her natural optimism quickly reasserted itself. "But maybe he wants to be family anyway. Maybe he's lonely like we were." Out of the mouths of babes, Naomi thought, remembering her mother's favorite saying. Children saw truths that adults spent lifetimes avoiding. The coffee shop Harrison had suggested was a small, locally owned establishment that had somehow survived the wave of gentrification sweeping through East LA. The owner, Maria Gonzalez, had been serving the neighborhood for 15 years, watching families come and go as rents rose and longtime residents were displaced. Harrison arrived 10 minutes early, his usual punctuality intact despite the chaos in his professional life. He had changed from his standard business suit into khakis and a simple button-down shirt, but even his casual attire probably cost more than most people spent on clothing in a year. Maria recognized him immediately. His face had been in the local papers often enough as the man behind many of the neighborhood's changes. But she served him coffee without comment, her manner professionally neutral despite the wariness in her eyes. Harrison chose a corner table where he could see the door, a habit from years of business meetings where information and advantage could shift with each new arrival. But tonight, he found himself nervously checking his phone, second-guessing his decision to reach out to Naomi, wondering if she would even show up. When she walked through the door at exactly 7 o'clock, Harrison felt something shift in his chest. She had dressed carefully, a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes, her natural hair styled in loose curls that framed her face. She was beautiful, but it was a beauty grounded in strength and dignity rather than the artificial perfection he was accustomed to in his social circle. She spotted him immediately and walked over with the careful composure he was beginning to recognize as her armor against a world that had too often disappointed her. "Mr. Sterling," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "Harrison, please," he replied, then hesitated. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," she admitted, her honesty surprising them both. "I figured this was when you'd explain the catch." "The catch?" "The real reason you helped us. The conditions I haven't heard yet. The price for your generosity." Harrison was quiet for a moment, understanding her suspicion and recognizing its validity. How many times had he offered help that came with hidden strings attached? How many deals had he structured to appear generous while ultimately serving his own interests? "There is no catch," he said finally. "No conditions, no hidden agenda, no price to be paid." Naomi studied his face, searching for signs of deception. "People like you don't do things like this without reasons. So what's your reason?" "You want the truth?" Harrison asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "I want the truth. The truth is that I've spent 20 years building an empire on the systematic displacement of families like yours. I've told myself it was progress, that I was improving neighborhoods and creating value. But 3 days ago, I looked at your daughter and saw something I had forgotten existed." "Which was?" "Innocence. Trust. The belief that adults are supposed to protect children, not profit from their suffering." Harrison's hands wrapped around his coffee cup as if seeking warmth. "When she asked me why I was dressed so fancy to throw people out of their homes, I realized I didn't have an answer that wouldn't make me hate myself." Naomi felt something shifting inside her chest, a careful thawing of defenses she had built over years of disappointment. "So this is about your guilt?" "No," Harrison said, then reconsidered. "Yes. Partly. But it's also about wanting to be worthy of the faith she showed in me. When she asked if I was going to help you, she looked at me like she actually believed I might be a good person. I can't remember the last time someone looked at me that way." "And you want to be that person?" "I want to try." The admission cost him visibly. "I don't know if I can be. I've been playing the role of corporate predator for so long that I'm not sure there's anything else left underneath. But I'd like to find out." Naomi was quiet for a long moment, processing words that seemed too honest to be manipulation. In her experience, men who sought to exploit or control rarely admitted uncertainty or vulnerability. They projected confidence even when lying, using certainty as a weapon. But Harrison's uncertainty felt genuine, his vulnerability unperformed. And despite every survival instinct screaming warnings, she found herself beginning to believe him. "What does that mean for us?" she asked carefully. "For Zoe and me." "It means you're safe," Harrison said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "Your home is secure, your daughter's future is protected, and you never have to worry about my company displacing you again." "And in return?" "Nothing." The word hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they dared cross. "Absolutely nothing. This isn't a transaction, Naomi. It's an apology." She felt tears threatening, tears she had held back for months of struggle and uncertainty. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the fear of trusting something that seemed too good to be true. "Why should I believe you?" she whispered. Harrison reached into his jacket and pulled out a legal document, sliding it across the small table. "Because I had my lawyers draw this up today. The deed to your building, transferred to a community trust with you as the primary beneficiary. It's yours, Naomi. Legally, permanently, irrevocably yours." Naomi stared at the document, the legal language swimming before her eyes as the magnitude of his gesture sank in. This wasn't just empty promises or temporary relief. This was security, stability, the thing she had been fighting for since the day she lost her job. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely audible. "Why would you give me an entire building?" "Because you need it," Harrison said simply. "Because your neighbors need it. Because I've taken too much from this community and it's time I gave something back. But the cost is less than I spent on my last vacation." The comparison made them both uncomfortable, highlighting the vast gulf between their worlds. "Money I won't even miss, in exchange for something that changes everything for you and your daughter." Naomi looked up from the document, meeting his eyes across the table. "What changed in you? Really? People don't just transform overnight because a child asks them a difficult question." Harrison was quiet for a long moment, considering how much truth he was prepared to share. But sitting here, in this modest coffee shop that probably wouldn't survive his company's next development wave, he found himself wanting to be completely honest for perhaps the first time in his adult life. "I was 7 years old when my father left," he said finally. "He was a dreamer, always chasing the next big opportunity, always promising that success was just around the corner. My mother worked 3 jobs trying to keep us afloat while he pursued schemes that never materialized." Naomi listened without interruption, sensing that this story was costing him something precious. "The day he left, I found my mother crying at the kitchen table, surrounded by overdue bills and eviction notices. She didn't know I was watching. When she finally saw me, she tried to smile and tell me everything would be okay, but I could see the fear in her eyes. The same fear I saw in yours 3 days ago." "What happened to you?" "We lost the house. Spent 2 years in shelters and temporary housing while my mother worked herself to exhaustion trying to get us back on our feet. I swore I would never be that vulnerable again, never let anyone have that kind of power over my security." Harrison's smile was bitter with irony. "So I became the kind of man who wielded that power over others. Until 3 days ago. Until I saw my mother's fear in your eyes and realized I had become everything I had once hated." He paused, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Until your daughter looked at me like I might be someone worth believing in." Sometimes our greatest transformations come from seeing ourselves reflected in someone else's pain. What moments have forced you to confront who you've become versus who you wanted to be? Share your turning points below. The silence that followed was heavy with shared understanding. They were both survivors of abandonment, shaped by loss and the desperate need for security. But they had responded to that need in opposite ways. She by building walls to protect her heart, by building an empire to protect his ego. Zoe drew you a picture, Naomi said suddenly, pulling out the folded paper from her purse. She wanted me to give it to you. Harrison unfolded the drawing with careful hands, studying the three figures holding hands under a smiling sun. The simplicity of it, the innocent hope it represented, made his chest tight with emotion he had spent decades suppressing. She wrote something on the back, Naomi added softly. Harrison turned the paper over and found a message written in a 7-year-old's careful handwriting. For Harrison. Thank you for helping us. Do you want to be our family? The words hit him like a physical blow, cutting through every defense he had ever constructed against emotional vulnerability. This child, who had every reason to distrust adults who made promises, was offering him something he had convinced himself he didn't need: belonging. I can't, he whispered, his voice breaking slightly. I don't know how to be family to anyone. Neither did I, Naomi replied, her own walls finally crumbling. Before Zoe, I was so focused on protecting myself that I couldn't imagine letting anyone close enough to hurt me. But she taught me that the risk of love is always worth taking. Harrison looked up from the drawing, meeting her eyes across the table. What if I disappoint her? What if I turn out to be just another adult who makes promises he can't keep? Then you'll learn from the mistake and try to do better next time, Naomi said, her voice gentle with understanding. That's what family does. We forgive each other's failures and help each other grow. Is that what you're offering? Forgiveness. I'm offering friendship, she said carefully. A chance to prove that you're the man you want to become instead of the man you used to be. Harrison stared at the drawing, at the three figures united under that bright, hopeful sun, and felt something fundamental shifting inside his chest. For 20 years, he had built his identity around power and control, measuring his worth by his ability to dominate markets and crush competitors. But sitting here, offered the simple gift of human connection, he realized how hollow that success had always been. I don't know if I'm worthy of that chance, he admitted. None of us are worthy of love, Naomi replied, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned to accept grace despite her flaws. We just have to be brave enough to accept it anyway. The coffee shop around them had grown quiet, other customers finishing their conversations and heading home to families and obligations. But Harrison felt like he was sitting at the center of something profound, a moment where everything he thought he knew about himself was being gently but firmly challenged. There's something else, he said, his voice stronger now with newfound resolve. Something I need to tell you about my board meeting today. Naomi tensed, recognizing the shift in his tone. What happened? They want me to reverse course. To go back to the old way of doing business. They're threatening to remove me from the company if I don't abandon what they call my emotional decision-making. And what did you tell them? Harrison smiled, and for the first time since she had met him, it reached his eyes. I told them that some decisions are too important to be left to spreadsheets. That I'd rather lose my empire than lose my soul. What does that mean for your company? It means I'm going to fight for the right to do business ethically, even if it costs me everything I've built. Harrison's voice carried a conviction that surprised them both. It means I'm finally ready to be the man your daughter believes I can be. Naomi felt her heart doing something dangerous, opening to possibilities she had sworn off after too many disappointments. But looking at Harrison, seeing the genuine transformation taking place behind his eyes, she found herself wanting to believe in the possibility of redemption. So what happens now? She asked. Now, Harrison said, carefully folding Zoe's drawing and tucking it into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. I go home and figure out how to be worthy of a 7-year-old's faith. And tomorrow, I start building something better than I've ever built before. Which is a life worth living. A legacy worth leaving. Maybe even. He paused, the words feeling foreign but hopeful on his tongue. A family worth belonging to. The words hung in the air between them, fragile as soap bubbles but carrying the weight of possibility. For the first time in years, Both Harrison and Naomi found themselves looking toward a future that held something more than mere survival. Outside the coffee shop windows, the city continued its relentless march toward tomorrow. But inside, at a small corner table, two wounded souls had found the courage to believe in second chances and the transformative power of unconditional love. The real test would come in the days ahead, when the initial euphoria of transformation gave way to the hard work of actually changing. But for now, surrounded by the warm light of possibility, they allowed themselves to hope that sometimes, miracles really could happen on ordinary Tuesday evenings in modest coffee shops. Sometimes, people really could change. Sometimes, love really was enough. The most powerful transformations happen when we choose love over fear, connection over control. What would you be willing to risk for a chance at genuine redemption? Share your thoughts below. The conference room on the 42nd floor of Sterling Tower hummed with tension as Harrison faced his board of directors for what he knew would be the final confrontation. 6 months of ethical business practices had cost the company millions in potential profits, but they had also created something Harrison had never expected, a sense of purpose that made every morning worth waking up for. "The quarterly reports are in," Richard Blackwood announced, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man about to deliver a killing blow. Revenue is down 18% compared to last year. The shareholders are furious, and frankly, Harrison, so are we. Harrison looked around the table at men who had once been his closest allies, recognizing the hunger for power that had once driven him as well. But now, their calculations seemed small and soulless, their obsession with profit margins as foreign to him as a language he had once spoken fluently but no longer understood. "Revenue is down," he acknowledged, his voice steady despite the stakes. "But community partnerships are up. Tenant satisfaction is at an all-time high. And for the first time in the company's history, we're building developments that people actually want to live in rather than simply invest in." "Pretty sentiment," Blackwood sneered. "But sentiment doesn't pay dividends. The Washington building project you insisted on preserving? It's generated zero return on investment. The mixed-income housing initiative you championed? It's bleeding money. You've turned a predator into prey, Harrison, and the market is eating us alive." "The market will adapt," Harrison replied, though he could hear the uncertainty creeping into his own voice. "Sustainable business practices always show better long-term." "There won't be a long-term if we continue hemorrhaging money." Thomas Chen slammed his folder on the table, his face flushed with frustration. 6 months ago, you were one of the most ruthless developers on the West Coast. Now you're running Sterling Development like some kind of charity organization. "Maybe that's what it needed to become," Harrison said quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. Jonathan Myers, Harrison's former protege, leaned forward with the predatory smile Harrison recognized from his own younger days. "We've called this meeting to inform you that the board has voted," Myers said, his voice carrying false regret. "You're being removed as CEO, effective immediately. Richard will assume control while we search for a permanent replacement." Harrison had known this moment was coming, had prepared for it during sleepless nights when the weight of his transformation felt like too much to bear. But hearing the words still hit him like physical blows, each syllable cutting away pieces of the identity he had spent decades building. "The company bylaws," he began, "have been reviewed by our attorneys," Blackwood interrupted, sliding a thick legal document across the table. "Your recent decision-making has been deemed detrimental to shareholder interests. We have the legal authority to remove you." Harrison stared at the document without reading it, understanding that his corporate empire was crumbling around him just as surely as the apartment buildings he had once demolished. But instead of the devastation he had expected to feel, he found himself experiencing something unexpected: relief. "There is one alternative," Myers added, his tone carefully casual. "Resume the old business practices. Cancel the community partnership programs. Return to the profit-maximizing strategies that built this company. Do that, and we'll consider reinstating you." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. All Harrison had to do was abandon the principles he had discovered, return to the comfortable cruelty of his former self, and he could reclaim everything he had built. His empire, his status, his carefully constructed life of isolation and control. He thought of the Meridian Hotel deal he had abandoned, the luxury developments he had cancelled, the millions in profit he had sacrificed for the sake of families he had never met. By any reasonable business metric, he had made disastrous choices that would be studied in MBA programs as cautionary tales about letting emotion override logic. But then he thought of Zoe's drawing, still folded carefully in his wallet, and the question that had started his transformation. Why was he dressed so fancy to throw people out of their homes? No, he said simply, the word carrying more power than any corporate merger he had ever negotiated. No. Blackwood's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. Harrison, you're walking away from $1 billion company. For what? A handful of tenants who will never be anything more than a drain on resources. Harrison stood up slowly, adjusting his tie with hands that were perfectly steady despite the magnitude of what he was losing. I'm walking away from a company that built its success on other people's suffering. And I'm walking toward something that matters more than money. Which is? A family that believes I'm worth loving, Harrison said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. A purpose worth fighting for. A legacy I can actually be proud of. He picked up his briefcase, the same leather attaché that had accompanied him to countless hostile takeovers and corporate battles, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he paused and looked back at men who had once been his closest allies. Good luck explaining to your children why Daddy's job was throwing families into the street, he said quietly. I hope the profits are worth the nightmares. The door closed behind him with a soft click that echoed like a gunshot in the silent conference room. Harrison's hands were shaking as he walked through the lobby of Sterling Tower for what he knew would be the last time. Employees who had once scrambled to acknowledge his presence now whispered behind their hands, word of his removal spreading through the building with the speed of wildfire. His phone buzzed with calls from reporters, investors, and former allies eager to distance themselves from his spectacular fall from grace. By tomorrow, the business journals would be full of articles analyzing his transformation from corporate shark to corporate pariah, his story becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting conscience interfere with capitalism. But as he stepped onto the sidewalk outside the tower that bore his name, Harrison felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: freedom. The weight of empire, the burden of ruthless success, the constant pressure to be harder and colder and more calculating than his competitors, all of it lifted from his shoulders like shackles falling away. His phone rang, and he was surprised to see Naomi's name on the display. Harrison. Her voice carried concern that warmed him more than any corporate victory ever had. I saw the news report. Are you okay? News traveled fast in the digital age. Harrison's removal had probably been reported by financial news outlets within minutes of his departure from the board meeting. But hearing the genuine worry in Naomi's voice reminded him that he wasn't facing this crisis alone anymore. I'm okay, he said, and realized with surprise that it was true. Better than okay, actually. I'm free. Free to do what? Harrison looked up at the tower that had once represented his greatest achievement and now felt like a monument to everything he had outgrown. Free to figure out what Harrison Sterling wants to be when he grows up. Naomi's laugh was warm and understanding. Zoe's been asking when you're coming for dinner again. She's been practicing reading so she can show you her progress. The mention of Zoe sent a familiar warmth through Harrison's chest. Over the past 6 months, he had become a regular presence in their lives, helping with homework, attending school plays, learning to braid hair with YouTube tutorials when Naomi worked late shifts at the community center where she now coordinated after-school programs. He had discovered that being part of a family wasn't about grand gestures or expensive gifts, but about showing up consistently, listening carefully, and caring about the small details that made up daily life. Zoe's loose tooth, Naomi's anxiety about her night classes, the leaky faucet in their bathroom that he had learned to fix himself rather than hiring someone else to do it. Tell her I'll be there for dinner, he said, already feeling his spirits lifting at the prospect of Zoe's enthusiastic greeting and Naomi's gentle teasing about his complete inability to cook anything more complicated than scrambled eggs. And tell her I'm very proud of her reading progress. Harrison, Naomi's voice grew serious. What are you going to do now? About work, I mean. It was a fair question. At 42, Harrison was facing the prospect of starting over professionally, his reputation in corporate real estate probably irreparably damaged by his transformation from profit maximizer to bleeding heart idealist. Traditional development companies wouldn't touch him, and he lacked the experience to transition into completely different fields. But over the past months, as he had spent time in East LA learning about the community he had once sought to displace, he had begun to see possibilities that his former self would never have considered. I have an idea, he said, his voice gaining excitement as the plan that had been forming in the back of his mind suddenly crystallized. Remember how you mentioned that the community center needs renovation but can't afford it? Harrison, you just lost your company. You can't be thinking about charity projects right now. Not charity, he said, his mind racing with possibilities. Partnership. What if I started a development company that specialized in community revitalization? Not displacing existing residents, but working with them to improve their neighborhoods while keeping them affordable. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Harrison wondered if the call had dropped. Naomi, are you there? I'm here, she said softly. That's a beautiful idea, Harrison. But is it practical? Can you make a living doing that kind of work? I don't know, he admitted, feeling strangely liberated by the uncertainty. But I have enough savings to find out. And for the first time in my adult life, I'm more interested in making a difference than making a fortune. What would you call this company? Harrison looked around at the city he had helped reshape through decades of aggressive development, seeing it now through eyes opened by love and humility. Washington's Sterling Development, he said without hesitation. Named after the woman who taught me that building communities is more important than building empires. He heard Naomi's sharp intake of breath, could picture the tears he knew were gathering in her eyes. You can't name a company after me, she whispered. Why not? You're the one who changed everything. You and Zoe showed me what I was destroying when I thought I was building. Harrison. Will you help me? He asked, the question carrying more weight than any business proposal he had ever made. Will you be my partner in this? Not just in business, but in life. The words hung between them, carrying possibilities that neither had dared to imagine 6 months earlier. They had built their relationship slowly, carefully, learning to trust each other through small gestures and daily kindnesses rather than grand romantic declarations. But now, standing in the wreckage of his former life with nothing left to lose and everything to gain, Harrison found himself ready to take the leap he had been contemplating for months. Are you asking what I think you're asking? Naomi's voice was barely above a whisper. I'm asking if you'll marry me, Harrison said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the question. I'm asking if you'll let me spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of the faith you and Zoe showed in me. I'm asking if you'll help me build something beautiful instead of something profitable. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of all the reasons why their relationship was complicated and impractical and fraught with potential problems. They came from different worlds, had different backgrounds, carried different scars from their pasts. But they had also found something rare and precious in each other, the courage to believe in second chances and the transformative power of unconditional love. Yes, Naomi said finally, her voice breaking with emotion. Yes to all of it. The company, the partnership, the marriage, the life we're going to build together. Harrison closed his eyes, feeling tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in decades finally spilling over. 6 months ago, he had been the most powerful developer on the West Coast, feared and respected and utterly alone. Now he was unemployed, professionally disgraced, and happier than he had ever imagined possible. I love you, he said, the words feeling natural and right despite how foreign they had once seemed. I love you too, Naomi replied. Now come home. Your daughter wants to show you her reading, and your fiancé wants to start planning our future. Your daughter. Your fiancé. The words wrapped around Harrison's heart like warm blankets, filling spaces he hadn't even realized were empty. He had spent his life building walls and accumulating possessions, thinking that security came from what he could control and dominate. But walking toward the subway that would take him to East LA, to the modest apartment that had become more of a home than his mansion in Beverly Hills had ever been, Harrison finally understood what he had been searching for all along. Not power. Not profit. Not the cold satisfaction of victory over competitors. Family. Belonging. The simple, revolutionary act of loving and being loved in return. 1 year later, the grand opening of the Washington Sterling Community Development Center drew a crowd that spilled out of the renovated building and onto the surrounding streets. Local families mixed with city officials. Former Sterling Development employees who had followed Harrison to his new venture mingled with community activists who had once protested his projects. Harrison stood at the edge of the crowd, watching Naomi cut the ribbon with the mayor while Zoe beamed beside her, wearing a new dress for the occasion. The building behind them had once been a neglected community center, its potential buried under years of deferred maintenance and budget cuts. Now it housed after-school programs, job training initiatives, small business incubators, and affordable housing development offices. It wasn't the most profitable use of the property. A luxury retail complex would have generated far more revenue. But looking at the faces of the people who would be served by this center, Harrison felt a satisfaction that no amount of money could have purchased. Daddy. Zoe broke away from the ribbon-cutting ceremony and ran toward him, the title she had started using 6 months earlier still making his heart skip with joy. Did you see? Mama let me help cut the ribbon. I saw, sweetheart. Harrison knelt down to her level, straightening the small blazer she had insisted on wearing to match his outfit. You did perfectly. Are you proud of us? She asked, her 7-year-old need for approval still catching him off guard with its directness. I'm proud of your mother for everything she's accomplished, Harrison said, looking over at Naomi as she posed for photos with community leaders. And I'm proud of you for being the smartest, kindest, most amazing daughter any man could ask for. What about you? Are you proud of you? The question, delivered with the innocent wisdom that only children possessed, made Harrison pause. A year ago, he had measured his worth by the size of his bank account and the fear he inspired in competitors. Now, surrounded by people whose lives had been improved rather than displaced by his work, he found himself applying very different metrics. Yes, he said, surprising himself with the honesty of the answer. For the first time in my adult life, I'm proud of who I am. Zoe threw her arms around his neck, her hug carrying more value than any corporate acquisition he had ever completed. Over her shoulder, he saw Naomi approaching, her wedding ring catching the afternoon sunlight as she smoothed down her dress. They had married in a small ceremony 3 months earlier, exchanging vows in the same community center they were celebrating today. Harrison's former board members hadn't attended, but the church had been filled with neighbors and friends who had watched their unlikely love story unfold with amazement and approval. How are the numbers looking? Naomi asked, slipping her hand into his as they watched the crowd explore the new facility. We're operating at a slight loss, Harrison admitted, but the community impact metrics are through the roof. We've helped 12 families avoid eviction, launched 8 small businesses, and placed 4 to 7 people in job training programs. And are you okay with the loss? Harrison considered the question, thinking about the man he had been a year earlier who would have seen any business operating at a loss as an inherent failure. But watching children use the new computer lab while their parents attended ESL classes in the next room, he found himself measuring success by entirely different standards. I'm better than okay with it, he said. We're building something that will serve this community for generations. You can't put a price tag on that kind of legacy. What legacy do you want to leave behind? What would it mean to you to be remembered for what you built rather than what you accumulated? Share your thoughts below. As the afternoon progressed, Harrison found himself in conversation after conversation with people whose lives had been touched by their work. Maria from the coffee shop thanked him for the small business loan that had allowed her to expand. Carlos, a single father, expressed gratitude for the job training program that had led to his promotion at a local manufacturing company. Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who had been facing eviction, showed him photos of her grandchildren playing in the building's new playground. Each conversation reinforced what Harrison had learned over the past year, that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars accumulated but in lives improved, that real power came not from controlling others but from empowering them, and that the most successful developments weren't the ones that generated the highest profits but the ones that generated the most hope. As the evening wound down and the crowd began to disperse, Harrison found himself alone with his family in the center's main room. Zoe had fallen asleep in one of the reading nooks, her head pillowed on a book about dragons and princesses. Naomi sat beside him on a bench, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched their daughter sleep. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly. "The old life, the corporate power, the mansion in Beverly Hills?" Harrison considered the question seriously, thinking about the man he had been and the life he had abandoned. There were moments, usually late at night when he was reviewing budgets or dealing with particularly difficult community meetings, when he remembered the simplicity of measuring success purely in financial terms. But then he would come home to find Zoe doing homework at the kitchen table while Naomi prepared dinner, would listen to their chatter about school and work and weekend plans, would fall asleep surrounded by the warmth of people who loved him not for what he could provide but for who he was becoming, and he knew with absolute certainty that he had made the right choice. "Never," he said, his voice carrying complete conviction. "I may have lost an empire, but I gained a kingdom." A kingdom. This, Harrison gestured to encompass not just the community center but everything it represented, the neighborhood they had helped stabilize, the families they had kept together, the future they were building one relationship at a time. A place where I belong. People who love me. Work that matters. A daughter who calls me daddy and means it. Naomi lifted her head to look at him, seeing in his eyes the peace that had replaced the driven ambition she remembered from their first meeting. "Any regrets?" "Just one," Harrison said, his smile carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "I regret that it took me 42 years to understand what was really important. I regret all the time I wasted building walls instead of bridges." "But you understand now." "I understand now." He pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair and the faint sounds of their daughter's peaceful sleep. "I understand that the best investment I ever made wasn't in real estate or tech stocks or corporate acquisitions. It was in learning to love and be loved in return." Outside the community center, the city continued its relentless march toward tomorrow, full of people chasing their own versions of success and happiness. But inside, in the warm glow of achievement measured not in dollars but in dignity restored, Harrison Sterling had found something that no amount of money could purchase, a life worth living and a love worth keeping. The man who had once thrown families out on the street like garbage had learned to build homes instead of houses, communities instead of corporations, relationships instead of revenues. He had discovered that true power came not from dominating others but from lifting them up, that real wealth was counted not in what he accumulated but in what he gave away. And as he sat there surrounded by the three great treasures of his transformed life, his wife, his daughter, and his purpose, Harrison finally understood what he had been searching for all along. He had been looking for home. And now, at last, he had found it. The fairy tale was complete, but the real story, of daily choices to choose love over fear, compassion over calculation, service over selfishness, was just beginning. And for the first time in his life, Harrison Sterling couldn't wait to see what tomorrow would bring. Because tomorrow would bring another chance to prove that sometimes, people really could change. Sometimes, love really was enough. And sometimes, the most broken hearts could be transformed into the most beautiful homes. The billionaire who had witnessed her humiliation and chosen to change everything had become, in the end, the man she always believed he could be. And the woman who had been thrown out on the street like garbage had become the architect of his redemption. Their love story had begun with an ending, the destruction of everything they thought they knew about themselves. But it had become something far more beautiful, a beginning without end, a family built on forgiveness, and a future bright with the promise of love multiplied rather than divided. In the end, that was the greatest fortune of all. Love has the power to transform even the hardest hearts and create families in the most unexpected ways. What unexpected blessings have emerged from your darkest moments? Share your stories of hope and transformation below. Sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives begin when we think the story is over.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.